Okay, so our next subject to dive into is what is thought of as the Enlightenment. And this happens in the 16th and 17th century, um, and into the 18th century. It's a process, right? These things go on. But it's a direct consequence of the Protestant Reformation in a way that the actual Protestant reformers never dreamed of. And that's something about the Protestant Reformation that I want to point out. We get this wrong historically quite a bit. The Protestant reformers, the people like John Calvin and Martin Luther and others, were generally speaking not at all for what we think of as freedom of conscience or freedom of religion. Now, freedom of religion and freedom of conscience were consequences of the Protestant Reformation, but not intended consequences, let's put it that way. When John Calvin broke away from the Catholic Church and started his own version of Christianity, he did not dream that anyone else would do the same thing to him. Right? He thought he was reforming the church. That's why it's called the Reformation. That the church had become corrupt, unscriptural, sinful, worldly, and Martin Luther thought he was reforming the church into what it ought to be and what it was before it became corrupt. But immediately, within his own lifetime, other people came along who disagreed with Martin Luther's ideas about what the Bible said. And they also broke away and made their own versions of Christianity. And that process continues to this very day, where Christianity, for many hundreds of years, was one thing under the Roman Catholic Church. And then beginning with Martin Luther, it fragments into all of these various, what we think of now as denominations. And this process continues to this very day. But each of these reformers thought that they were establishing the true version of Christianity and that everyone should follow them. And then, their dream, their vision was a new Christianity united under their theology, under their ideas about what Christianity is. The idea that any of these people were for everyone thinking for themselves and coming to their own conclusions about what they would believe, and that each person should be free to follow their own conscience and the dictates of their own inner light as far as what they would believe in terms of religion, was just the furthest thing from their minds. And they persecuted one another relentlessly. which is interesting to me, and this happens a lot. I worry about this. It bothers me when people who want to reform a system because they believe that it's corrupt or that it is abusive or that it is oppressive, immediately begin oppressing and abusing themselves. And it happens a lot. It's one of the tough things about our human condition is we tend to do this. John Calvin, who was the probably of the two great names of the Reformation, Martin Luther and John Calvin are like they're on the top of that pinnacle of the most influential people to break away from the Catholic Church and form their own theologies based on their own understandings of the Bible. And a lot of people don't know that John Calvin, whose theology underpins a great many denominations to this very day. Southern Baptists, for instance, are Calvinistic in their theology. He had one of his religious enemies, a person who was preaching things that Calvin did not agree with. He had that person burned alive at the stake. What bothers me, worries me, because one of the cries of the Reformation was that the Catholic Church was oppressive. But in the religious conflicts that tore Europe apart during the Reformation, it was kind of equal opportunity oppression and awfulness, all the way around. And that mythology even follows us in our own, ideas about the founding of America. And we have this idea of the pilgrims coming here for religious freedom. That was not why they came here. Puritans were not at all on the side of religious freedom. They had attained enormous power in the 17th century, so much so that they had the King of England executed. And the Puritans ran England for a little while and made themselves so wildly unpopular that eventually they themselves became kind of a persecuted minority who then fled to America, in one small group of them, in order to establish their own theocracy, their own Christian society in this new world where they could do whatever they wanted. But they were not at all interested in religious freedom as such. However, this breakup of ideas, you had one worldview governing all of Europe for a very long time. Everyone walked around in the same basic universe, and it was the universe of Roman Catholic Christianity. And when that fractured and fractured and fractured and fractured, and this enormous chaos ensues, where nobody comes to the forefront and says, and actually reforms Christianity. All of these different sects end up gathering their own followers, gathering their own rulers, gathering their own, and there were wars and all kinds of the history of Europe during this time is just one giant conflagration of fighting over who's going to be Protestant and who's going to be Catholic and who's going to be what brand of Protestant. And because of this, because nothing solidified out of this, this new possibility arises, and it's that maybe nobody has the last word on what the universe looks like. Maybe there is no such thing as a necessity to unify this whole of humanity under one worldview. And people began to explore for themselves the universe around them in ways that were not religious at all in some instances. And this kind of inaugurates a sort of a new way of knowing things. And it's no accident that while this is happening, while the authority of religious scriptures and religious hierarchies loses its power, these new inventions show up that help people see more deeply into the world around them. And among those are the telescope and the microscope, right? Those are pretty important, right? Something that lets us see, things that are very far away and things that are very small. And these new technologies begin to reveal things that are astonishing to everyone, right? The idea that there's all these little creatures in the world, the tiny microscopic things that might be why everyone got sick, because they drank water, infected with this bacteria instead of that, a witch cursed the well or something. Just the Galileo's thing and that kind of that archetypal conflict between Galileo and the church, the authority of the church, where he's like, the earth is not the center of the universe. The earth goes around the sun, and he could prove this with his technology. And so this begins this kind of movement away from these ancient explanations for things, that some religious authority has the last word on this. And a new idea that says we are going to explore for ourselves what the world is and what it looks like, and reach conclusions based on those explorations. And that's the birth of what we think of as science. That's the beginning of that particular process. Now, what's fascinating to me is that in our own time we are seeing a reaction against this Enlightenment project that's been going on since the 16th century, or late 16th, early 17th century, right? There are people who have rejected Galileo's conclusions, right? They think the Earth is flat and the sun revolves around it, and they are looking at religious texts and saying the Bible says, that this is the shape of the universe, and so that's what we're going to believe, and everything else is a lie, and our very we have to revisit how we know things, which is interesting to me. And I, 10, 15 years ago, would never have dreamed that this would be part of a lecture, right? Here's how we know stuff. And so I'm going to throw some things up there, some other a video for you to look at on this idea. But how do we know that the Earth revolves around the sun instead of the sun revolving around the Earth? Well, we trust authorities on this, right? And there are lots of them. And even the ancient Greeks knew that the Earth was round. For instance, they had actually calculated its size. There's ways you can do this with shadows and stuff. I'll throw another video up about that as well, and how the Greeks knew this. So. But when you talk to a flat earther, when you listen to their arguments, they can seem convincing in certain ways, because we're not used to these kinds of questions. Well, how do you know? Have you actually walked around the Earth? Did you ever go west until you ended up back where you started from? Well, no, none of us have done that. I've come close, traveling around the world, but. And what this does is this leads to a kind of anarchy when it comes to ideas and how we know things, and so we have to revisit that, right? We know things based on evidence and evidence by authorities, and it doesn't help that those authorities are sometimes wrong about things, right? That science often says this is the way it is, and it turns out not to be that way, right? It's extraordinarily difficult to actually prove something. Even something as simple as that the Earth is round. It can be done, don't get me wrong, but it's not as easy as you think. And when people reject those ways of knowing things, and they say, I don't believe your authorities. I'm not going to trust anything that I don't see with my own eyes, unless you can get me up in a spaceship and fly me around the Earth and show me that it's round. I'm going to believe what the Bible says about it. That's extraordinary that is happening, and so I want to explore that a little bit, and let's look at what the Enlightenment has to say about this, because that's the beginning of this revolution to say, no, we're not going to trust just religious authorities. We're not going to trust feelings. We're not going to trust superstitions. We're not going to trust traditions. We're going to actually look at things and decide the truth about things based on our own ability to observe. And so let's dive into that just a little bit and look at the work of a guy named Francis Bacon, who is, he kind of inaugurates this idea of the empirical method, which we think of as, the scientific method grows out of this. And there's a particular mode of reasoning involved in the empirical method. And it works like this. What people in the Enlightenment age began to understand was that you can derive general principles from specific observed phenomena, and especially phenomena that repeat. Things repeat, right? If you can observe something and you observe it again and again, and you observe it in different circumstances, you can begin to formulate ideas, laws, if you will, about how the universe works as you observe these things. And so things like a law of gravity, right? That's another, and Isaac Newton is another kind of late Enlightenment figure. But he's, the famous, he's sitting on the apple tree, apple falls on his head. I don't know if that really happened. But, a law of gravity. Well, stuff falls down, right? Larger objects attract smaller objects. This happens, and we can observe it happening again and again and again. And because of that, we can say there's a general law of gravity. And then we can, observe that law, and we can make all kinds of other observations about it, which gives rise to the whole science of physics. But it's important to understand that we can't look at every single apple falling from every single tree. We are not capable of observing everything. So what we do is we observe some things, and we try to observe them enough and establish these patterns that show a general understanding of how things work. It's entirely possible that some apple falling from some tree somewhere is levitating at this moment. We cannot know that. But this type of reasoning is called inductive reasoning, where you begin with specific observed things and derive general principles from them. And that's kind of how science works. So things like the theory of evolution, for instance, which is very controversial in a lot of circles. This is the buckle of the Bible Belt. And I have friends who will argue against the theory of evolution. And one of the things they will say is that it's just a theory. And yes, but it's a scientific theory. And the scientific theory is derived from inductive reasoning. And so while it is absolutely true that we cannot go back in a time machine and absolutely, empirically prove evolution, we can observe lots and lots and lots of patterns, lots of things that indicate that this general principle is accurate. And Francis Bacon he begins this idea of saying, let's make this valid. Let's observe the universe in this way. And this becomes very exciting to a lot of people. And practically every aristocrat on the planet, for some reason at this time during the Enlightenment, got excited about this stuff. And that's why you see, and once again, the wealthy, the aristocracy, or the people who have the money and the leisure to do this stuff. But that's why you have Benjamin Franklin out there flying his kite, with, waiting for a lightning to strike. And I love these myths and how they were. He had a servant holding that kite, but it wasn't him risking his life on the end of the kite with the lightning. But when Franklin was doing that, he was operating very much in the mode of an Enlightenment figure. Thomas Jefferson was working on a index of Native American languages. He was a linguist. And these people just decided to do this stuff. They just basically learned this stuff themselves and were fascinated by anything that they could observe. And it was kind of intoxicating, this idea that because the world suddenly changed, things opened up, things got better, right? It's infinitely better to understand that the bacteria in the well is making people sick, instead of, it was that old lady down the street that, that cursed the well and we have to burn her alive now, right? The things got better in ways that were obvious, right? And significant. And there was this kind of almost a hope that this scientific method, this empirical method, would eventually solve all of our problems, right? It was certainly solving many of them. And the beginning of this technological revolution was also happening, and people could see dimly where this was going. Science fiction begins in many ways at this time because people are looking, oh, wait a minute, our machinery is getting better all the time. What happens if this keeps going for a while, right? And so there was this moment of intense promise. It all fell apart and went into chaos and ruin, which we will cover in the very near future. But there was a little while there where it seemed that science would save everything, and very many people were passionately interested in this, and all these different societies formed of wealthy people who were interested in science getting together and writing papers and studying things and learning things and experimenting on things. It was a passion of the wealthy folks of that time. And America is probably a great example of that. Our founding fathers were that's what they did, and it's one of the reasons we exist as a democracy, as a way of life, is because people these founding fathers, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Adams, all these guys, they were thinking about social order in Enlightenment terms. Instead of just saying, well, we need a king because that's the way it's always been, and the church has always, endorsed the king. And they were like, wait a minute, why do we have to do it this way? Can we not look at observable, phenomena and say, what's the best form of government? How should a society be organized? What might we do? And they called American democracy this experiment because from the time that Caesar crossed the Rubicon and brought his army into Rome and dissolved the power of the Senate, or weakened the power of the Senate, from the time that he declared himself the Emperor of Rome until the ratification of the Constitution of the United States, there were no functioning democracies on the planet. That's more than 2,000 years of no democracies anywhere at all, until the founding fathers said, hey, let's do this differently. Let's figure out a better way to run a culture. And we're in the middle of that experiment now. We're still doing it. It hasn't been very long. 200 years of a blink of an eye in terms of human history and human cultures. I mean, the Egyptians lasted for 3,000 years. So, we're still, is this going to work? We don't know. But that's the Enlightenment spirit, to find new ways and to apply reason and science to these questions and try to make a better world as a result of that. And so that's kind of the gist of what the Enlightenment was. And quickly, let's look at some specific things that Francis Bacon had to say about the ways he thought that we were failing to be accurate about reality. He had these concepts that he called idols. And the first were idols of the mind. An idol is something you worship falsely, right? So he's looking at these things and he's saying, these are things that we worship. These are ways that we mistakes that we enshrine. And he was about tearing down these idols, about helping people to question these idols, to see that they are not legitimate. And the idols of the mind are fallacies common to all people, just because we tend to trust our senses and our emotions. And so, one of the things a flat earther will do, if you ask them why they believe the earth is flat, is they'll stand outside. It's Oklahoma, it's flat around here, and they'll say, look, it's flat, right? And Francis Bacon would call that an idol of the mind, right? You're trusting your senses when your senses are notoriously unreliable. We all make mistakes based on this. And then emotion, right? I mean, all kinds of scams and con artists. And every TV commercial in the world is about manipulating our emotions to get us to believe something, right, that isn't true for the most part. One of my favorite recent commercials that's just absurd is the Subaru and what was it? I don't know how the commercial goes, but at the end of it says, love, it's what makes Subaru a Subaru. And that's simply untrue, right? It's absurd on the face of it. Whatever a Subaru is, right? The transcendent, value of love has nothing to do with that car, right? These two things are not the same. But because we trust our emotions, if the Subaru people can get us to associate the emotion of love with their car, we're much more likely to buy them. And Francis Bacon would call that an idol of the mind. And then he has what's called idols of the cave. And idols of the cave are fallacies related to our education and our cultural context. So we are all limited in many ways by how we learn and what we learn. And unless we are able to step outside of that box and look critically at what we've been taught, we can continue to believe things that simply aren't true. simply because we've been taught that, or simply because our culture believes that. And there are all kinds of examples of this, and they're kind of shocking. But and then one of the things we're seeing right now, one of the reasons our culture is in quite a bit of upheaval, is because we're seeing some of these things questioned for the first time in ways that are making people uncomfortable. I'll give you an example. Every person of my generation, through 1,000 songs, movies, TV shows, it was drilled into us as something that is just an unquestionable fact that the reward that a man should get for a job well done is a beautiful woman. That's movie after movie after movie, all the way up to, even you look at something like the first episode of Star Wars, right? Han Solo gets Princess Leia because he does the hero thing, right? That's right. That's complete crap, right? It's like, that's not the way the world works, nor should it work that way. And you see a lot of people are shocked by that. And there's a whole lot of harm that comes from this, right? The idea that women should be valued as trophies that validate the accomplishments of men. Well, most of the awfulness that brought about the Me Too movement is simply that idea being acted upon. Men in positions of wealth and power and authority simply deciding, I deserve this, and so I'm going to use my wealth and my power and my authority and by having myself in a place where there are no consequences for my actions, to do all kinds of predatory things. But our whole culture was taught that. And I don't know why. But this goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. I mean, this idea, and the problematic nature of this idea goes. It's been part of our culture for millennia. But now we're starting to maybe question that as an assumption about the world in general. Well, Francis Bacon would call that an idol of the cave, for sure. Then he has idols of the marketplace. And these are fallacies related to simply miscommunication and the effects of language. And these are very powerful. And we don't generally look at these, right? There are certain thoughts that are much easier to have in different languages. The kinds of things that we are able to consider, or the ease with which we are able to consider certain ideas, is dependent upon the language that we are able to think about those things in. English is great because it's such a versatile language, right? And also English, we do this, right? If another language has a word we like, we just grab it. We're like the Borg, we're going to assimilate everything that's useful to us. But it doesn't change the fact that there are simply thoughts that are easier to have in German than they are in English. And language changes over time, right? If I were to read a letter by my great-grandfather in which he talks about being gay, that might be seriously confusing to me if I did not know that the meaning of that word has changed dramatically from the 1890s until now. Language does that. When I was in college, when I was freshman, sophomore in college, in the mid '80s, it was still every man meant human. It was that's the language we all used, and the project to begin to make our language more inclusive in terms of how we use pronouns in that way was fascinating to watch that process take place. But in the beginning, it was very strange not to say a sentence like this. When doctors, or when people are getting ready to become, when a person is getting ready to become a doctor, he should study very hard, right? That would be a typical way of saying things. Instead of, they should, because a doctor can be a woman or a man. These are idols of the marketplace, things that related to the ways that we use language and the ways that language limit us and limit the ways we think. And lastly, he had what are called idols of the theater. And these are fallacies related to philosophy and worldviews. And human beings do this. We absolutely do adopt worldviews, throw that framework on our reality, and then filter it according to that worldview. And if we do this, it's very easy for us to be wrong about things. And it's extraordinarily hard to avoid these kinds of mistakes. Marxism, for instance, is a failed idea. People believed it was true. It was a worldview, a way of looking at the world, looking at the universe. It just happened to not be true. It turns out that the whole universe isn't simply a conflict between economic forces and a progression from feudalism to capitalism to communism is not inevitable in history. That's just not true. But because people believe that for a very long time, very large, massive groups of people believe that, there was incredible chaos and awfulness in the world. Something like 200 million people died violent deaths in the 20th century because of the idea of Marxism. And Francis Bacon would call that an idol of the theater, a mistake based on the way that a person has decided to understand their world. And I think what I hope you can get from this is that these are things that we're all susceptible to. And what Francis Bacon and what the people of the Enlightenment would say is that it is our duty as human beings to do what we can to minimize these mistakes. And that the world will be a better place if we do that. That was, and I kind of want to end this with that, because that kind of echoes the hope of the Enlightenment, right? The optimism of this. The world's going to be a better place if we can do these things. If we can avoid these fallacies, if we can not worship these false idols that have distorted our understandings of the world, and actually explore the world around us and understand our universe, that we can arrive at ideas and procedures and things that make the world a better place. And it does to a large degree, and we were still involved in that project. Right, the creation of vaccines, for instance, which, God, that should not be controversial. It should not be. That would be interesting to take, and maybe that'll be a future, very, very, very soon. That might be our next discussion question. Which idols would Francis Bacon identify as governing the anti-vaccine standpoint? Or the pro-vaccine standpoint, for that matter, right? That's once again, guys, the humanities is so difficult to teach. I could spend months on the Enlightenment, but that's just a brief, very broad brush overview. And we're going to look at, in the very near future, we're going to look at the America, right, where we are a product of the Enlightenment. And we're also going to look at how that fell apart, and how the Enlightenment project, while it did wonderful things and it brought us, all this amazing technology and made us all live longer and healthier and all kinds of stuff, it didn't save the world. And in some ways, science made the world incredibly worse. There's a movie called Congo, which is an adaptation of a novel by Michael Crichton. It's got one of the greatest lines in movie history. I'll see if I can find that. If I can find it on YouTube, find that particular clip, I'll throw it up there. I doubt I can. But in this, there's one of the characters is this kind of piratical, roguish sort of mercenary guy, and he's leading this group of scientists deep into the jungle in forget what part of Africa they're in, but one of the scientists figures out that this guy is just basically a criminal, and he says, you're a criminal, and the guy says, well, aren't we all? And the scientist says, I'm not a criminal, I'm a scientist. And their guy, he kind of leans back from me and says, you know, I've been an arms dealer from time to time. I've run guns and weapons. You sons of bitches ruined the world. Okay, yes. Science has not been an unmitigated good in the world. Here's something to know about people, and I'll end on this. This is true. Think about it. There has not been one advancement in human technology, not one, that we have not immediately turned into some kind of a weapon. That is a fact that bears some reflection, I think. So your next discussion question is up, and we will do this again on Thursday, where I will throw up another lecture and some more things for you to look at. Be looking in the course announcements, and I'm kind of filling out our course content as we go. And once again, great job on what you guys have done so far. I'm thrilled with the work that you're doing, and this has been a great semester so far. Let's keep it going.